Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, in Cyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at FS-ISAC. Cloudflare, a key partner to the financial sector and part of our Critical Providers program, has a pretty unique position in that 20% of the world's internet traffic goes through its network. So it was fascinating to hear what Grant Bourzikas, Cloudflare's Chief Security Officer, thinks about how AI is changing the very nature of the internet and the threats and risks associated with that the financial sector needs to understand. So let's start with the basics. How are you seeing the nature of the internet change as LLMs come into daily use?
The internet business model is changing. So today, if you search for who is Cloudflare, right? It's going to come up on Google. It's not going to actually go to cloudflare.com. It'll actually go to Google, and it will provide all of the content that the LLMs have done. There's not a business model for paid search. And then what's going to happen is that the content in the LLMs are going to erode. And so we've taken a big stance on this because, about 20% of all websites come through us. We see every IP address on the internet roughly six times a day. And so we have a handle on kind of what's going on on the internet. The other interesting thing is that about only 7% of all AI bots are coming from, the Anthropics and the DeepSeeks and the Geminis of the world. And so you have 93% of bots that we don't know what's going on. And so what we did on July 1st was we created technologies and our bot capabilities and actually are blocking by default all AI LLMs, kind of the caching services that are actually pulling that data into the models. And so now it's going to be a paid for service that we're working with many content writers. Most of the big publications in the world are using us now to say, how do I actually create my business model of the future, which is going to be a shared kind of revenue component with them.
So how did you weigh all of that in this consideration of the blocking of the web scraping? And then how do you think that, get into how the financial sector is going to be impacted by this and how you think we should be dealing with it?
Statistics are probably the best thing on this. Is 10 years ago, for every visitor that Google sent you, they crawled the website twice. So, that seems like, hey, we're going to crawl your website and we're going to send it out. 6 months ago, Google was 6-1. So they went from 2-1 to 6-1. OpenAI 6 months ago was 250 crawls for every one user, and Anthropic was 6,000 crawls to every one user. Today it's 18-1 for Google. OpenAI is 1,500 to 1. And Anthropic is 60,000 to 1. And so what this means is they're taking the content and bringing it back. And so, when we think about this, a lot of the media, right? This is a media thing. How do I actually get content? How do I think about freedom of speech? And from a cyber standpoint, we're already really good at this with our bot detection, our bot products. And so it's just turning it a little bit different. Instead of trying to identify a bot, it's trying to stop the bot. And how do we do this? The other thing is, it sounds like this is, a bad thing for the LLMs. The LLMs providers, the Googles and the OpenAIs, all are supportive of this because they realize that they can't cannibalize the content. Because the content will not be generated. And so there's actually a big partnership between us, all of the OpenAIs of the world, and they're large customers of ours, and the media organizations say we have to find a sustainable way from a business model on how the internet's going to be consumed, because you can already see it is that content's going to get into a model. People are going to stop writing content and the model's going to become less sophisticated and interesting. And I think that is a key thing of what it is. And even from a strategy, like, you should know what you're going to protect and what you're not. And security people say, well, didn't we have robots.txt and all these files to protect it? Well, they weren't listening, right? I mean, we always say in cyber that people just would ignore the robots.txt file. Or, they would just go around it. We all, as security practitioners, know that if there's, we try to put some sort of enforcement up and they'll go around it and they'll put another enforcement up. And this is the way it's gone on for as long as I've been in cyber, since the late 90s. It's just this cyclical process.
Right. And we obviously know about like deep fake enabled fraud and all of that kind of stuff. But if customers can't tell what's real, what are the threats that the financial sector needs to be thinking about? And how do we need to think about this sea change in how the internet is going to work in terms of preserving the trust of our customers and other stakeholders?
Yeah, when I think about financials and banks and think, how do I think about KYC? How do I think about authenticating users? I should be thinking about it today, but I'm going to be really concerned in 2 years. And kind of back to your first point, which is the content that is being captured looks at commonalities, right? You're trying to find commonalities, you're crowdsourcing things within an NLP. You'll have a hard time determining what is accurate, what is not accurate. And it will just produce what articles are out there. And so we all know that these LLMs are looking at content in aggregate, not necessarily quality of content. And so they'll have to look at how they're doing that. I'm sure they're doing that already, but I think those are things. And so when we start to think about how we're, if you look at me, I'm relatively out there. You can see my face, you can see my voice. It wouldn't be hard to try to get me or have somebody impersonate me in my bank on, trying to make a wire. How do you know it is me? Well, you text my phone. Well, we know about phishing and smushing and all of that, those things, right? Well, we can't do video anymore. And we're already seeing actors do video and deep fakes on interviews to try to get jobs. We're already knowing that they're finding avenues. Voice recognition is very easy to do. And so how do we think about just in simple terms of knowing our customer, understanding who our customer is, if they're not sitting in front of us? And I think that is going to be a problem. There'll be technologies that we will try to do, and they're out there in the market. I think a lot of the venture capital space is in this AI thing of how do we think about fraud and how do we think about these things. But when I, was doing deep fakes 2 or 3 years ago to where they are now, it's wildly different. And I think, the question is, does that seem real? I think is the question I always ask. Like, did that person really say that, or is that a fake? And I think to your question about how are we going to understand if something is real or fake is really hard.
Think about somebody who's not switched on to it. I don't, how can we hold people to expectations that, frankly, I don't even know that we could meet even if we tried, especially when deep fakes are getting more and more sophisticated and more realistic, and branded emails and branded phone numbers and all of that. It's like so easy to impersonate. It feels like a lot to be asking of customers.
I think it is. And I think it's the scenario I always hear that's the bad one is, you get a phone call from your son says, I need $1,000. I'm in a bad spot. And it sounds like, right. And that's easy to do. And so what we're seeing is much more advanced. We might see a phishing email followed up by a phone call. I think we have to use and apply like the common sense rule. Like, would my son call me asking for $1,000? But I've also been with people that have been in that situation and their kids did ask them for $1,000. I needed some money. I haven't got paid yet. And I'm moving into a new apartment and I need money, mom, right? Or dad. And I think I've seen that. And so I think we're going to have to go back to, is that a real thing? Because what we're seeing in the threat landscape, I think is very interesting, is that the attackers are targeting kind of your heart or things that you're not thinking about, right? Like, the one that pops into me is like, is anybody thinking about DNS registration and registrars and trying to take over your DNS records? Well, they are, and they're finding different ways, or they're trying to attack you We've seen that, the DNS thing's interesting because I'm trying to, take over the registrar for Cloudflare.com. And if I can get Cloudflare.com, I can do a lot of bad things, right? Or we're seeing payroll systems attacked and I'm trying to change your information, your account information, and various things with domain hijacking, kind of advertising ways, taking over advertising accounts that have reputation. And they're doing it in a way that is very creative, versus mass scale where there is. And so when I think about these things, it's how do we, maybe you should just call your son back and say, let me call you back, and call him or call your daughter, doing things that are a little bit more simplistic, and doing, the same thing. The banks always have said this, right? They say, we will never call you. Or if you have a problem, make sure you call in the
Yeah.
back of your credit card, right? And so I think some of these brash tactics are going to get better because, they're just very easy and they can catch you at a bad time. I think if somebody that wasn't cognizant, like I think, your parents or a, sibling or your friends that, could be a nurse or a doctor, like they may not pick this up. And I think, getting some of this common sense and, I think we see it on the internet. We see it on Twitter. We see it in, Facebook. We see it in Instagram. Like, is that real? And I think if we had to add, that's the question I always ask, is that real? I was watching something this morning. Like, is that real? Like, I don't think that's real. And like, but you have somebody talking about it. And I think the other one is you're seeing very convincing people, the way they talk is very authoritative, very confident, and like, well, that person must be right. And so when you start to get deep fakes and voice recognition and really tearing at your heart on attacks, I think that becomes a very difficult thing to defend. And people, like, going to have to get a little more sophisticated, or what I call more basic on, I don't think my bank calls me, I'm going to call you back, right? And those are things that I always think about, is how do we do this and put back a little bit of the human touch, because we've gone all digital. And I think everybody thinks this. I like to go visit people and see people in person, and you could tell if I meet you over Zoom versus meet you in life, you have a better connection. And so I think as we think about these things, there might be a little bit of a, um, retraction back to some of the old ways we used to do business, with kind of handshakes and making sure we understand these things. And that may be the better way to do things, is because I think, what happens in the next 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years is going to be wildly different with artificial intelligence and LLMs and robots and all the things. And I think if we can use it for good, it'll be all positive for us. But I think we don't use everything for good, right?
I mean, I do wonder what that means in a financial system that has essentially gone completely digital, right? I mean, like, when was the last time you went to a bank branch?
And I think it'll be very interesting for different types of transactions. If you have to place a big wire for your home, it may be different, right? I think where we have to get to with this is better intelligence, and so contextualized intelligence. We're seeing a lot of actors do a lot of things in the sharing of data, the sharing of public partner private partnerships. We're doing a lot of work with some of the larger banks on how can we think about data, right? At the end of the day, it's an IP address, it's some sort of context. But and what I would even say, the internet though is moving into IPv6 shared IPs. It's hard, everything's encrypted, so it makes it a lot harder. But I think that's going to be a key piece to the future of how do we actually understand analytics and behavioral analytics around what customers are doing. I think is going to be a very key thing, and probably more important in the future than it has been in the past, because I should probably have predictable patterns. Maybe I don't know. But I think, organizations are going to have to do it. And it goes back to, we have to use artificial intelligence and the banks and the financial services. We can't not tell people not to use it. It's bad. It's evil. They're going to take our data, because we're going to have to use those systems and those technologies to be able to fight the bad guys. Right. And so how do we do these things? How do we actually shorten a development life cycle on this. And I think that's going to be, or how do we shorten the time it gets a detection out there, whether it's on the website with fraud or whether it's internal, security operations. I think those are things that are going to be very key, and having data is going to be at the root of all of it.
We've been talking about, KYC and how do you identify that the person is who they say they are. One of the things I also wanted to get into was agents, right? And everybody's talking about agentic AI, and that's the coolest thing in 2025. How do you think, CISOs and firms should be thinking about the whole explosion of agentic AI and managing identity from that perspective?
Yeah, I think this is a big one, right? I think what you're seeing in the tech space is everybody wants an agent, right? And I kind of go back to this was, in the mid 2000s where there was a security agent for everything and it started to cause problems, more performance, right? And I remember I've probably been in 2 financial firms that we had over 25 agents because we had to have an agent. And then there was this agent, consolidation. I think we're back into that, but I think the risks are more, right? So we're going to put more agents on things. And there's a much more advanced type capability, right? I want to put an agent on the box that could pull telemetry or it could pull logs or it can pull this, right? So we, us security people want to do this. And then the marketing people might want to put an agent to understand X, or, sales may want to look at productivity, and, HR may want to look at this. And now you're going to have 10 or 20 or 30 agents all competing for resources. And we all know this, that, when a lot of these are small startup organizations and early in the development, there's going to be security holes. They're not going to do, they'll pin certificates. They won't set up the authentication right. There'll be open API holes. And I think we're going to see many more endpoints compromised because the authentication wasn't set up. I think the second thing of this, and we're seeing it prominently around data localization, or what a lot of people call data sovereignty, but I think it's where, now we have this data problem. And so one of the things I think is very interesting is like the location of where we process things in the future is going to be very powerful, right? Like, do we need to deploy this on an endpoint? Do we need to deploy this in country? Do we need to deploy this in, one of the big hyperscaler data centers? And I think it's something, as we think about kind of what I call like this architecture of, if I'm in France and I have employees in France, I need to have capabilities to capture that data in France. The same as a German employee, the same as, but in Germany, right? Or US in US. And we're seeing these regulations. And so I think we've had this pivot of everything goes into these big hyperscalers, but hyperscalers can't operate in all of the countries in the world. How do we actually drive that in the future? Where should things be more applicable? Because you're going to have this data problem. So I think you really have, the probably the 2 hardest things in cyber, a data problem and access. And so with agentic AI, of what are we going to do in the future regarding access and access to endpoints? Because we've been trying to take access away from people for years, admin privileges, and now we want to deploy this agent with admin privileges. And I think that's going to be, a problem that we're going to have to get ahead of. And, I think the hard part is we can all handle that, but the business wants us to do this. And it's everybody else is doing this. So how do we do this securely, and how do we do this well? And this is something nobody's done, right? And so I think this is something we think about of where do you run, how do we control data? Because we're seeing this global component, and many of the large countries already have this data localization of my country. People have to keep the data in the country. And I think it's a good thing to have, but it makes doing centralized operations very difficult.
Do you think that firms are going to have to basically like weigh a bunch of, whatever their own concerns are and then kind of act alone?
I think, I mean, one thing I do think which is good in the banking sector is, the lines of defense, and there will be enough risk conversations around first line and the control office and second line, depending on where they are in audit. And so I think, right, you're going to have a lot of scrutiny on what this looks like. And so I think that is good. But I also think there are some simple things that we should be thinking about, like, and it's one that we do. Everybody in our company has access to an LLM. It's an inference only model, so there's no training, and right, we use it. Now we still have guidelines of what we do, but we've enabled it across the organization to do it. Right. I think that's something that can do, take all the concerns out is how do we, I can't use X chatbot because it's going to take the data or it's going to train on the data. Well, don't let it, right? There's capabilities to do that in the models, and that's one to do. Well, what about all the other models? Well, Cloudflare has technology that can redirect to the model or stop other models and say we only want to use Gemini or we only want to use ChatGPT, we only want to use Anthropic, and then say anything else we see can pull it back in. And I think that's one of the ways that it is a very easy win for organizations when you think about it, is to get the controls. Now you want to work with, make sure the regulators know what you're doing and making sure that second line and third line understand this, but making sure that that's there, build the architecture out. I think around data localization, data sovereignty is you're going to have somebody that operates in countries, but I think these have to be more conscious decisions than kind of drift ones, because we always see these problems of where it is. And so I always think, people on this call and within the industry, they're very smart people that are doing some crazy things. I think just giving them some of these ideas to think about, like how are we going to handle data localization and data sovereignty? How are we going to think about agentic AI? Should we put this startup that's been in existence a year, it's got 15 people, and we're going to deploy it on 250,000 agents? Probably not a good idea. And so I think some of these things, as we think about, is like, what is the direction? How are we doing this? Right? Because the other big risk we see is this supply chain risk, right? We see it. I talk to CISOs that are worried about supply chain, and now we're putting an agent, we have this little startup company that, might have a CISO or a field CISO, but they're not going to have, what the big banks or the small banks have from a resource capability scrutiny. And so we really have to think about, those kind of components of who we're working with, how are we going to manage access to these agents and what are they running? And then where's our data going? And I think from a financial sector, that's very positive. And then I would wrap, how do we think about intelligence around this? How do we use this data to our advantage? And I even think that the security technologies will change over the next 3 to 5 years. They're already starting to change with how we do things with this agentic AI, this kind of data localization component, and then hyperscalers. And I think that'll be a very interesting thing as we see where it goes, and making sure you have the right vendors in place and the partners in place to be able to get you there 5 or 10 years where you're not caught up in kind of a legacy world is going to be very important.
How can you be proactive when you have to react to such rapid change all the time?
I think for us technology people, this is the fun part. We get to see the evolution of this, right? We're seeing these IDE LLMs that are changing how we do development, right? I think it's such a cool thing for some people that, like, when we think about it's a way to enable. Now, it creates security risks, and we've been doing some testing, and I've seen some customers already do this, is, they'll program things and they'll find a security vulnerability and they say, well, that looks like a security bug, security problem. Can you fix it? And they'll fix it. But just like us, we make these problems. And I think when I think about this things, like what is going to be core? I mean, if I go back, even in my career, one of the things that are problematic, it's access and data. And I think if we can get those right, there are going to be regulations, they're going to change, but we already know countries want to keep the data in the countries. We already know access is a problem and we need to tighten that down. We already know data and how we structure that. How do we use threat intelligence? I think these are things every CISO and every security and every practitioner are doing. it just comes down to, is that, are we thinking about these things is the most important thing in our strategy, or are we thinking, um, or are we thinking, hey, I need to do X? And so one of the things I always say is, how do we think about security modernization, right? There's always IT transformation and IT modernization, but, you know, we have to think about business problems. We haven't talked about technology a whole lot here. We kind of talked about the surrounding components, but I can't do that if I have 50 or 60 vendors that I'm operating, right? Now, maybe if you're a large bank and you have thousands of people and $1 billion budget, but even when I had that, it was still hard, right? Because the bigger banks still had bigger problems, and they're widespread in hundreds of thousands of employees and millions and millions and millions of customers. And so how do we think about what is important that we should be focusing on? I think modernization, right? Using the right vendors, making sure that we're enabling the business is going to be a core component. And I think what stands in that is, are the vendors today that I'm using going to get me there of where we are in 5 years? Think about, how do I simplify my network? How do I simplify my employee access models? How do I deploy AI on the edge in a country? Those are things that people should be thinking about, because I think these point solutions that do one thing, especially in this modernization of where AI is going, is you need a vendor that can help. Not just one vendor. You need,
Yeah,
5
you
to
need
10 or
resilience,
15
obviously.
that are going to, yeah, you need to be resilient and go through things. And right, resilience is one of the biggest factors, is how do I make sure I have that in place, that I can execute. And that's, we see that a lot, is I need another vendor. Now you can start to actually shift traffic or have capabilities with this. But I think it's going to be an interesting world. And that's why I always go back to when I finished my master's 3 years ago, none of this stuff really existed. And, and, and it was wise to go through it, but I wish I could go back and do it now and use one of these IDEs to help write code, because I'll get stuck in code problems for hours where I could just type it in and it would tell me what to do.
I mean, I think one of the things that stuck out to me through this is, like, we still have to keep a laser focus on these basics, and the around all of this stuff, the technology is going to change, which it always has. But, access, data, intel, managing vendors, resilience, these are still the basics, and they're going to remain the basics no matter what. It's just frankly, the complexity of it feels like it's going to, it's just going to keep expanding and exploding, right? It's just going to be more complex, and the latest technologies and all of that. But the fundamental issues and the fundamental principles of what it means to be a CISO and protect, the trust in your firm doesn't really change. Would you say that's true?
I would agree. I mean, I think some of these core principles haven't changed in 30 years. And so they just iterate faster, right? So Moore's law is faster, or I mean, it's new, it's Elizabeth's law now, right? But I think as we think about these, a lot of these things, we've had access problems for years. That's where all the 99% of all the breaches originate. We have data problems. We just have to, think about it in a modern world where we need to use that data or that intelligence. We need to be more resilient, right? We need to make sure our supply chain is protected. Those things we've all worried about, and so it's just a different angle. And I think as CISOs and practitioners of, how do I think about this? It's probably more important now, that you can enable the firm to be able to move quick, because you're going to be able to need to do that. How do you become more nimble? How do not have 40 processes to roll something to the cloud? And I think this is where, what does that look like? And banks aren't going to be on taking major risks, but I think you need to understand, where the world is going, what the internet's doing, what's that consumption model drive. And then, maybe my vendor portfolio looks different. Maybe the people I hire look different, right? Maybe I need to hire X. And I think those are many things that we have with my peer group when I think about, what are the things I hear? Cost and complexity and people. Those are the three things. My environment's too complex. My cost keeps going through the roof. And I need to find ways to, have more people in the organization. And AI may fix the people thing, right? Complexity we need to drive, and complexity also, reducing complexity lowers costs. So I think as we think about these things, it'll be a very interesting thing, because it's just the next iteration of where we're going. It's just faster than it was 2 years ago. It's faster than it was 5 years ago. And so I always think, even attackers, when it was like they would do something and we would defend, they would attack, they would defend, and it might have taken 180, or, the old Verizon reports that were 300 days. That may be happening in hours, if not minutes. And so I think as we think about this, that's where our heads need to be. And then how do we help our business grow and be successful? I think is the other one, is how do we enable them?
Okay. Well, that was a lot.
Great conversation. Thanks. Looking forward to hearing more from you and working with you guys more as part of our Critical Providers program. And any last words you want to say?
That was great. If I can ever help anybody, please reach out. Happy to do it. Happy to be kind of back end of the financial sector. So it's wonderful to see everyone. So thanks for having us on today, and really enjoyed the conversation.